Thanks, Mike, for that kind introduction, and it is a pleasure to be back in the U.S. to describe some of the work that we did to try to put science and risk estimation in a more formal sense with a statistical basis to understand, at least in this data set, what the risk was or the strength of association between animal proteins, porcine proteins specifically, that are included in swine diets, and what the strength of association is with those diets that are delivered to pig farms and their PED status. I think it's worth just pointing out quickly the nature of the team we put around this and what people's roles were in this project. I was in charge of study design, analysis of data, and fundamentally reporting was my job. You'll notice two other authors on this paper are from JBS United. JBS United is a large feed manufacturing company working across the Midwest with a headquarter in Sheridan, Indiana. Matt Ackerman, some of you will know, he's a practicing veterinarian in Indiana but travels across a good bit of North America in clinical swine practice. Matt's job in the project was really to be the liaison between the research group and data analysis at JBS, and the fact that we had to have some connection out to farms that were affected with the disease or not. So that was Matt's job as a liaison. Chris Troxel and Ronnie Mosier are the two from JBS. Chris Troxel built the IT system at JBS and is fundamentally a database man, a SQL programmer with really no background in pigs or production per se. Ronnie Mosier is a nutritionist by training. In the context of this project, he was project manager. He was the one that, as I demanded resources from the company, he found those people or resources in order to get the project done. So to quickly take you through what the project was like and what the roadmap for my discussion this morning will be, background very briefly, because I think this group is probably well familiar with the sort of work that's been done already with feed contamination with PCV2, or in this case porcine-origin proteins, and what that relation might be to PED. I want to talk briefly about what the biases are related to this study and questions that you may have about my role and preconceived notions about a company like JBS and what they wanted to have happen with this study. Right, and then we'll classically go through objectives, methods, results, and discussion. The work has been submitted to JAVMA with the hope that they find it suitable for publication, so I hope you'll see that coming out in a few months. So background, everyone knows this. PED showed up early in 2013 in the U.S., with Canada reporting then early 2014. A number of things had happened in the U.S., and there was certainly a recognition early on about where did the virus come from in terms of the pathway that it was introduced to the U.S., if in fact it was an introduction and not in fact an emergence events in the U.S. Interesting that no one's really talked about that, but PED emerged somehow in Europe in the early 70s, right? And all viruses have to come from somewhere. I think it's unlikely that PED emerged in the U.S. You know, the indication is the epi around that sort of suggests it was an introduction. But fundamentally, this industry and the government support structure that should be looking at these sorts of issues has not fundamentally really interrogated the roots of introduction. So I don't think we know at the end of the day where the virus came from. So certainly people were worried about feed early on and imported product that was included in feeds, JBS included in that. So lots of routes were hypothesized. I was actually sitting in Afghanistan doing sheep and goat brucellosis work when I got a call from Matt Ackerman early in 2013, and he said, I got a problem. Can you help me think through all the things that may be going on and related to my herds that certainly appear like they've got PED? So he was my early introduction into the project, but he's also got a relationship with JBS United. So JBS early on was very aware of issues related to feed and how they needed to manage that. Everybody was worried about things like vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and animal proteins. So they were doing some trace back. That stimulated some bioassay work that they sponsored, and then ongoing concerns because of conflicting data on the bioassay work that was happening. They realized that they needed to put some more commitment and effort into sorting out what their role was as a company in this disease. So at that point, they invited me to come in as an outside person with some of these epi skills to help direct a project and understand what the risk might be. Right? You're also familiar with the Canadian situation and this empirical association that was identified very quickly between importation of spray-dried plasma and the occurrence of a cluster of their early outbreaks. So all of that suggested we needed to put a bit of science around this particular topic. So just to talk through the bias for a moment, I have a paid consultancy role with JBS. I'm not retained. I'm not an employee there. I was simply brought in to manage this project. JBS United is a large animal nutrition company. Clearly, like any other suppliers, if there's a problem with their product, they want to be the first one to know it, not the last. To their credit, they said, look, there's certainly outcomes that are more desirable than other outcomes, but fundamentally, as a company, we need to know what's going on. So come into the company. You've got carte blanche to ask for any people, any information, any data that you think is useful to generate some objective understanding of the problem. So it's been a good relationship. I've enjoyed the process. I think the world knows at this point that lots of ways that this virus is getting moved around the country. Feed can be contaminated or, in fact, cross-contaminated and therefore can act as a PED vector, right? And the caveat, of course, is just like any other product. We've got lots of ways. I think the industry knows very well the importance of cross-contamination, anything from people to transport vehicles to, in fact, what we think are clean pigs, but in fact are contaminated, infected pigs that we're moving around. So all sorts of sources of cross-contamination. Feed is certainly one of the things that we need to think about as well. Okay, some unpublished data was floating around early on in the industry, some bioassay work that some of which saw the light of day in conference proceedings, some of which has ended up in peer-reviewed publication. But at the end of the day, several things had been done with conflicting outcomes. If I look across that unpublished data, what's my observations? You can agree with these or not. My general observations around the anecdotal evidence was that spray-dried plasma protein, that was the ingredient people were most worried in, was and is PCR positive. And we know the challenges around that. Is it infectious or inactivated virus? We simply don't know. Right? But spray-dried plasma protein, a number of the samples that you're going to check today are going to be PCR positive, but because of the nature of that product and the difficulty with which it is to culture the virus, really difficult to confirm that by virus isolation. We know if you orally expose pigs to PCR positive spray-dried plasma, there is the possibility that infection will occur. We know that's a fact. It's been demonstrated, but it certainly doesn't happen in every instance. Related to that, feed formulated with PCR positive spray-dried protein can also be PCR positive, that complete feed diet, right? But oral exposure to feed that contains those ingredients appears to be, right, not as infectious. In fact, I think you'll struggle to go out and find, I'm not aware of them, bioassays whereby they fed complete feed with known contaminated, I shouldn't say that, known PCR positive spray-dried protein. Those are not today resulting in infection in that bioassay model. But we know that's an experimental small-scale situation. So, right, we keep trying to learn a bit more every time we take on another project. Since that time, 3 projects have been published, and I hope you're familiar with these. These are sort of key studies driving this industry at this point. So if you're not aware of them, get out and have a read. Scott D. and others recently published what they've called this proof of concept study. I won't review these in details. A key message that came out of that study: feed can be a vector for porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, even when it has been formulated without something like spray-dried plasma protein, right? Spoke directly to this issue that cross-contamination is something we have to consider. The Canadians, in the last month, have published a summary of the early days of their outbreak and the work that they followed up with in terms of bioassays on product recovered from that initial cluster of farms. That work, again, my summary is that they confirmed that product is certainly PCR positive, the spray-dried protein is positive, and can contain infectious virus. They determined that, concluded it. We know that as a fact. again, really struggled in that study to have complete feed that included that, actually causing infection in pigs. Porcine and others, another interesting little project you should look up, intentionally spiked spray-dried plasma protein with viable PED virus. In their hands, exposure doesn't necessarily result in infection. Right? Speaks to the fact that there's variation in experimental conditions and expected variation in the outcomes. What bothered me and what I really appreciate JBS coming to the party for was, right, nobody had really gone out and said, what's the data available in the world telling us about the quantitative risk or association between these products that we're thinking are risky and the occurrence of disease on farms. Right? I think it's a frustration that was driven home to me as I sat and listened to paper after paper about PED experiences in North America yesterday. And what I saw was table after table of raw data and bar charts. Now, this industry is sitting on an absolute mountain of data that can help us understand these things in a field setting. Yet we continue to rely on crude data, our feeling about what the data is, what we observe to happen, what we think is going on, and then go make advice to our clients about that. We've got clever people, we know how to do the analysis, and this industry has absolutely reams of data to put some science around it. So I was pleased to get a chance to apply that philosophy to this particular problem. Right, on to the study. Objective was a simple one, to investigate the strength of association between exposure to porcine-origin feed ingredients and the occurrence of PED. Study design is an old classic for sorting out risk factors, a field-based, retrospective case control study on Midwest U.S. pork farms. The null hypothesis for a study like that, again, what we're trying to disprove by doing the study is that there's no association between exposure and disease. We hope to find a difference. That's the design of the study. Any study like this, you have to put a substantial emphasis on what's the reference population and what sample of pork farms are you going to drag out of that to actually do the experiment on. Reference population is important because that's where you're going to make inferences to. Right? No one really cares about the sample results. It's saying, what can we learn about the broader industry? The reference population for this study, the premises, locations at which prepared feed or feed ingredients were delivered by JBS between May 2013 and August 2014. We've just updated the data as of Friday of last week. Premise locations at which they deliver include single-site pork production operations, premises within multi-site production enterprises, and in some instances, secondary private feed milling facilities. Amongst all the mills in the JBS system, there were 2 mills at that point in which they were equipped to do ingredient tracking at an ingredient level and a lot level of each ingredient. So we could tie ingredient lot number to mixing batch out to a farm. All right? Premises, in this case, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Ohio. The study population that we drew upon to actually do the work is as follows. We have to establish a group of cases and a group of controls, and we're going to compare the observations between them. Criteria for a case was that all premises in the reference population with PED outbreaks that had been confirmed by laboratory diagnosis. We also called those vets and identified the date of first appearance of clinical signs relative to the laboratory diagnosis day. And they had to be getting fed from one of these 2 mills where we could do ingredient lot level tracking. Right? So we had to be able to get that data. Those 2 criteria then defined a case. The assumption, of course, to meet that null hypothesis is that if feed was the source of infection for the PED outbreak on that case, then it must have been delivered in the 2 weeks prior to the start of the outbreak. Now, you can argue, is it a week, a 2-week, or month? My decision was, after some consultation within our group, 2 weeks is the time frame that we're going to look at in terms of putting that farm most at risk for a feed-delivered contaminant. Risk products that we looked at, we've already talked about spray-dried plasma protein. In this sample, we also had access to data on spray-dried blood cells with that acronym, choice white grease, and hydrolyzed porcine peptones, which I've abbreviated as HPEP. For those of you that aren't familiar with these products, aside from grease, these are processed, they're dried, there's time and temp requirements around it, there's a manufacturing structure and process around them. But that's an example of what spray-dried protein plasma looks like. These are not liquid products. The study population in terms of controls that we're going to contrast to the cases, right, this was our thinking. Took a long time to get our head around this, right? Risk product ingredient lot numbers, right? So lot numbers of those ingredients that were delivered to case premises were backtraced up to the manufacturing mill, right? We then took those lot numbers and queried the entire customer database and forward traced to identify the complete list of premises in the reference population to which those lot numbers also went. So we backtraced to the mill from PED cases, found the lot numbers, went out and found everybody else in the system that got those same lot numbers. Statistical analysis is pretty straightforward, but I am going to take you through a little example of odds ratios so you get a feeling for what the math is like behind this. Right? We're measuring the strength of association, right? It's not cause, it's the strength of association between each of the animal protein ingredients and the occurrence of PED. Odds ratio in this sort of a study design is the measure we use. Several methods for getting there. I'll just talk you quickly through the 2x2 contingency table method because I think it makes intuitive sense. There's no black box regression, right? No hard drives on the computer chattering, waiting for some magic to come out. This stuff makes a lot of sense. The other issue, though, you need to recognize we had to really think about managing was the fact that lot numbers are nested within an ingredient. All right, so there's a hierarchical effect that we have to manage in the data set because they're not necessarily independent, right? They're related to each other. So Mantle-Hensel is how we manage this. I'll talk you through it. Odds ratios demystified. By definition, odds of the disease in an exposed group divided by the odds of disease in the non-exposed group. Think about a six-sided gambling die, right? It has six sides. What's the probability of rolling a 3? Right? It's one success, right? One side of the dice is a 3 divided by 6 sides of the dice. 1/6 is the probability. In this case, we're talking about odds. Successes over failures. The odds of rolling a die is a 1 success and 5 non-successes, right? So similar sort of measures, they're interpreted the same. What we do is take the population of farms, premises in this study, and we put them in a 2x2 matrix. Every premise in the study fell in one of these 4 cells, disease positive and disease negative, and whether they were exposed to a lot number of an ingredient or not exposed to it. Every farm can only fit in one part of that. The odds ratio then is very simple, right? Here's successes, right? Positive farms for exposure, successes over non-successes, right? A over B. Non-exposed population, C over D. And we just divide the two. We looked at the odds of disease in the exposed group compared to odds of disease in the non-exposed group. It's that simple to understand. I just made up some data here so you could follow the math quickly. 112 premises in my little example. I simply plugged some data in there that would be easy to talk through. In this case, there were 11 farms exposed to this risk factor. One of those 11 was positive for exposure, and 11 were exposed, one was positive for disease. So 1/10 gives us a 0.1 or 10% on the top of the equation, right? 1/100 or 1% disease incidence, if you will, in the non-exposed population. That gives us 1%. We divide the two and say that the difference is a 10, right? So in this case, the odds ratio is a 10. Right, it's 10 times more likely to be, exposure is more likely to occur, right, 10 times as likely to occur on a case than a non-case. That's how we're going to interpret the data. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, the results. Strength of association between 4 ingredients in this case, and the occurrence of PED was estimated at both an ingredient and lot level. Right. In addition, we looked at fish meal as we thought that might be sort of a control product to look at through the analytical process. 43 cases and 418 controls are what fell out of the sample. Right. Going to give you a couple examples of the output that comes out of this, and we'll just talk through it. Right. This is spray-dried protein plasma supplier 1. We had 6 lot numbers represented in that, and an overall estimate of the odds ratio. So odds ratios are scaled along the bottom on a log 10 scale, and you'll see I've got a heavy dark line sitting at 1. That's unity. If the top of the odds ratio was the same as the bottom, right, the risk of exposure and disease is the same. There's no additional risk, right? So things that fall, measures, right, lot numbers that fall on the right side of 1 are stronger, more strongly associated with cases. If they fall on this side of 1, right, between 0 and 1, they're more strongly associated with controls, right? In this case, we looked at 6 lot numbers, right, and an overall measure. In this case, we do a bit of statistical testing at each lot number, and if there are statistical differences in association between lot numbers, right, we have to keep them separate. We can't combine the data. If the data suggests they're all the same, there's no difference between lots, and that's important from a mitigation standpoint, right? Do we have a bad product, or do we have lot variation? Right? If there's no difference between lots, we can combine the data, get a single larger sample size, and a more powerful estimate. In this case, we've got a couple approaching outliers. It's just at the level of significance where it says we cannot combine the data. Crudely, we have to do the Mantel-Hensel adjustment. You'll see the Mantel-Hensel adjusted odds ratio falls below 1, suggesting the overall strength of association between this product and PED is not strongly associated with cases. Similarly, with choice white grease, we had 10 lot numbers. We've got one clear outlier. You can see, in fact, the 95% confidence intervals are way outside the rest of the population. This, in fact, was the single highest ingredient lot level odds ratio we had. I can't explain why it came up. We would have thought choice white grease is a pretty low risk amongst all the other animal proteins we put in. Nonetheless, it showed up. We chased it down, could find nothing in particular or unusual about that product. Maybe it's just a spurious result. At the end of the day, we make the Mantel-Hensel adjustment because there's an outlier, and the overall risk, right, it does some weighting and deals with this uncertainty that says the overall risk for choice white grease, again, falls on the non-risky side. Now, to sum up all the ingredients, rather than go table by table, this is the master table of outcomes. Right? So again, odds ratios on the bottom, spray-dried plasma supplier 1, supplier 2, fish meal, HPEP, CWG, or choice white grease, and red blood cells. And there's a typo in the online version of this, right? That should be HPEP, and that should be choice white grease. Right? What we see is basically everything is falling on the strength of association being with controls rather than cases, with the exception of red blood cells. But remember, right, this is a sample we're looking at of a larger reference population, and that's why we do statistics. We have to understand how certain are we that the true value in the reference population, in fact, is represented by our point estimate in this sample. Right? It says the true value for the population, the reference group, is 95% likely to be somewhere on the not risky side to risky side. So we don't have good confidence that, in fact, even red blood cells is contributing much risk to this, despite the fact the point estimate is sitting just over 1. We don't have good confidence in the answer. So fundamentally, looks like everything, nothing is sticking its head up as something that is adding a lot of risk to a PED caseload. Okay, hard to understand. What does an odds ratio, right, in this case, that's about a 1.4, as I recall. What does a 1.4 mean? 1.4 times more likely to be associated with a case than a control? But how bad does it get? I mean, cigarette smoking and lung cancer, right? Those end up off the chart, right? That's the ones you go figure out first and control and put mitigation on. Not that low odds ratios don't count, but at some point you got to decide where you're going to make your investment on managing risk. The analysis of this data set, right, suggests we don't have strong overall risk with these products in the data set. Right? Been a bit of other epidemiology done on this, some odds ratios that have been reported. The work that Jim Lowe did with trailers going back to abattoirs, he was sort of reporting some 3 and 4s as odds ratios related to clean trucks and dirty coming back out. Bob Morrison published some data, didn't publish it. To my knowledge, it's just been out in proceedings. 4 times, 8 times, 7 times. Those are the things you start to pay attention to, and clearly they're activities that you intuitively think as being important. right? Being a sow farm, so which sort of is another way of saying a lot of movements, rendering pickup, right? Those things also make biologic sense. So just trying to give you some perspective on how much should I worry about an odds ratio of 1.5, whether it's significant or not. Okay, discussion and some of the difficulties with the study. In some cases, more than one cohort of pigs was represented at a given delivery premises. All right? The management around that potential bias is that identical situation occurred both for cases and controls. In other words, if you're a positive delivery site, regardless of how many sites are behind you, you're fully quarantined and identify as a PED site or not, regardless of the number of sites behind you. So any bias introduced by that should have been managed. Secondly, some premises received more than one lot number of an ingredient, or multiple deliveries of one lot number, or diets were not identical for cases and controls. 5% inclusion versus a 3% inclusion. In other words, is there a dose effect? Right? We simply don't have enough data to really investigate this thoroughly. I did have a crack at least the multiple delivery part of it. Nothing stuck its head up in terms of additional deliveries adding additional risk. Right? But again, it's still a modest sort of data set, but nothing, again, was sticking its head up to me. Other risk factors were not assessed in this study due to the fact it was retrospective and we were looking back in time in 15 months. Fundamentally, this was understanding feed risk. Right? All outbreaks were included. No attempt to distinguish between the source of infection on these different outbreaks. Doing that, stratifying, we think this one was due to transportation. We should take it out of the data set. That, in fact, introduces its own bias because we don't know if it got yanked out of the data set for good reason or not. So we took all the cases without bias. Conclusions. Right? Eric's conclusions today are that ingredients that we looked at had negligible to very low association with PED in this study. All right. Minor differences among lot numbers for some products. One supplier of spray-dried protein and choice white grease. Right. Some difference between lots, but the overall effect was still not adding risk. Right. And the differences were still all on the left-hand side of one. Nothing came out of this study, in my estimation, that produced compelling evidence for recall of those products. All right. What's the message you should take home and go talk to clients about? And it's the same thing if you're a feed dealer, right? Work with reputable suppliers, right? Work to improve traceability from ingredients out to the pigs, and there's certainly off-the-shelf commercial solutions for doing that right now. Educate clients and production staff, communicate, and report. Reporting, right? We've got to find these cases. Right? Unless people are prepared to report, we can't, in fact, do any of this work.